further assurances and clarifications we have received from the European Union on the Northern Ireland Protocol. As a proud unionist, I share the concerns of members who want to ensure that in leaving the European Union we do not undermine the strength of our own union in the UK. That is why, when the EU tried to insist on a protocol that would carve out Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK's customs territory, I said no. And I secured instead a UK-wide temporary customs arrangement, avoiding both a hard border on the island of Ireland and a customs border down the Irish Sea. I also negotiated substantial commitments in the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration to do everything possible to prevent the backstop ever being needed, and to ensure that if it were, it would be a temporary arrangement. But listening to the debate before Christmas, it was clear that we needed to go further. So I returned to Brussels to faithfully and firmly reflect the concerns of this House. The conclusions of December's Council went further in addressing our concerns. They included reaffirming the EU's determination to work speedily to establish by the 31st of December 2020 alternative arrangements so that the backstop will not need to be triggered. They underlined that if the backstop were nevertheless to be triggered, it would indeed apply temporarily. They committed that in such an event, the EU would use their best endeavours to continue to negotiate and conclude as soon as possible a subsequent agreement that would replace the backstop. And they gave a new assurance that negotiations on the future relationship could start immediately after the UK's withdrawal. Since the Council and throughout the Christmas and New Year period, I've spoken to a number of European leaders, and there have been further discussions with the EU to seek further assurances alongside the Council conclusions. And today I have published the outcome of these further discussions with an exchange of letters between the UK Government and the Presidents of the European Commission and European Council. The letter from President Tusk confirms what I said in the House before Christmas, namely that the assurances in the European Council conclusions have legal standing in the EU. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Attorney-General, has also written to me today, confirming that in the light of the joint response from the Presidents of the European Council and the Commission, these conclusions, quote, would have legal force in international law, and setting out his opinion, reinforced by today's letter, that the balance of risks favours the conclusion that it is unlikely that the EU will wish to rely on the implementation of the backstop provisions, and further that it is therefore his judgment that the current draft withdrawal agreement now represents the only politically practicable and available means of securing our exit from the European Union. Mr. Speaker, I know that some members would ideally like a unilateral exit mechanism or a hard time limit to the backstop. I've explained this to the EU and tested these points in negotiations, but the EU would not agree to this because they fear that such a provision could allow the UK to leave the backstop at any time without any other arrangements in place, and require a hard border to be erected between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I have been very clear with them that this is not something we would ever countenance, that the UK is steadfast in its commitment to the Belfast Agreement and would never allow a return to a hard border. But it is not enough simply to say this. Both sides also need to take steps to avoid a hard border when the UK is outside of the EU. Failing to do so would place businesses on the island of Ireland in an impossible position, having to choose between costly new checks and procedures that would disrupt their supply chains or breaking the law. So we have the backstop as a last resort. But both the Taoiseach and I have said consistently that the best way to avoid a hard border is through the future relationship. That is the sustainable solution, and that neither of us want to use the backstop. So since the Council, we've been looking at commitments that would ensure we get our future relationship or alternative arrangements in place by the end of the implementation period, so that there will be no need to enter the backstop and no need for any fear that there will be a hard border. And that is why, in the first of the further assurances they've provided today, the EU has committed to begin exploratory talks on the detailed legal provisions of the future relationship as soon as this Parliament has approved the deal and the withdrawal agreement has been signed, and they have been explicit that this can happen immediately after this House votes through the agreement. If this House approved the deal tomorrow, it would give us almost 2 years to complete the next phase of the negotiations. And of course, we will have the option to extend the implementation period if further time were needed for either 1 or 2 years. It is my absolute conviction that we can turn the political declaration into legal text in that time, avoiding the need for the backstop altogether. The letters also make clear that these talks should give particular urgency to discussion of ideas, including the use of all available facilitative arrangements and technologies for replacing the backstop with permanent arrangements, and further, that those arrangements are not required to replicate the backstop provisions in any respect. So, contrary to the fears of some honourable members, the EU will not simply insist that the backstop is the only way to avoid a hard border. They have agreed to discuss technological solutions and any alternative means of delivering on this objective, and to get on with this as a priority in the next phase of negotiations. Second, the EU has now committed to a fast-track process to bring our future trade deal into force once it has been agreed. If there is any delay in ratification, the Commission has now said they will recommend provisionally applying the relevant parts of the agreement so that we would not need to enter the backstop. Such a provisional application process saved 4 years on the EU-Korea deal, and it would prevent any delays in ratification by other EU member state parliaments from delaying our deal coming into force. Third, the EU has provided absolute clarity on the explicit linkage between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and made that link clear in the way the documents are presented. I know some colleagues are worried about an imbalance between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, because the EU cannot reach a legal agreement with us on the future relationship until we are a third country. But the link between them means the commitments of one cannot be banked without the commitments of the other, and the EU have been clear they come as a package. Bad faith by either side in negotiating the legal instruments that will deliver the future relationship laid out in the political declaration would be a breach of their legal obligations under the withdrawal agreement. Fourth, the exchange of letters confirms that the UK can unilaterally deliver all of the commitments we made last week to safeguard the interests of the people and businesses of Northern Ireland and their position in our precious union. For it gives clear answers to address some questions that have been raised since the deal was reached. That the deal means no change to the arrangements which underpin North-South cooperation in the Belfast Agreement. That Stormont will have a lock on any new laws the EU proposes should be added to the backstop, and that the UK can give a restored Northern Ireland executive a seat at the table on the joint committee overseeing the deal. Mr. Speaker, President Juncker says explicitly in his letter that the backstop would represent a suboptimal trading relationship for both sides. We've spoken at length about why we want to avoid the backstop, but it is not in the EU's interests either. For this backstop gives the UK tariff-free access to the EU's market. It does so with no free movement of people, no financial contribution, no requirement to follow most of the level playing field rules, and no need to allow EU boats any access to our waters for fishing. Furthermore, under these arrangements, UK authorities in Northern Ireland would clear goods for release into the EU single market with no further checks or controls. This is unprecedented and means the EU relying on the UK for the functioning of its own market. So the EU will not want this backstop to come into force, and the exchange of letters today makes clear that if it did, they would do all they could to bring it to an end as quickly as possible. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, I fully understand that these new assurances still will not go as far as some would like. I recognise that some members wanted to see changes to the withdrawal agreement, a unilateral exit mechanism from the backstop, an end date, or rejecting the backstop altogether. Although it should be said that this would have risked other EU member states attempting to row back on the significant wins we had already achieved, such as on control over our waters or the sovereignty of Gibraltar. But the simple truth is this: the EU was not prepared to agree to this, and rejecting the backstop altogether means no deal. Whatever version of the future relationship you might want to see, from Norway to Canada to any number of variations, all of them require a withdrawal agreement, and any withdrawal agreement will contain the backstop. and that is not going to change however the House votes tomorrow. And to those who think we should reject this deal in favour of no deal because we cannot get every assurance we want, I ask, what would a no-deal Brexit do to strengthen the hand of those campaigning for Scottish independence, or indeed those demanding a border poll in Northern Ireland? Surely this is the real threat to our union. Mr. Speaker, with just 74 days until the 29th of March, the consequences of voting against this deal tomorrow are becoming ever clearer. With no deal, we would have no implementation period, no security partnership, no guarantees for UK citizens overseas, and no certainty for businesses and workers like those I met in Stoke this morning. And we would see changes to everyday life in Northern Ireland that would put the future of our union at risk. And if, rather than leaving with no deal, this House blocked Brexit, that would be a subversion of our democracy, saying to the people we were elected to serve that we were unwilling to do what they had instructed. So I say to members on all sides of this House, whatever you may have previously concluded, over these next 24 hours, give this deal a second look. No, it is not perfect, and yes, it is a compromise. But when the history books are written, people will look at the decision. People will look at the decision of this House tomorrow and ask, did we deliver on the country's vote to leave the European Union? Did we safeguard our economy, our security and our union? Or did we let the British people down? I say we should deliver for the British people and get on with building a brighter future for our country by backing this deal tomorrow, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. In December, the government shamefully pulled the meaningful vote on her deal, with a promise that the Prime Minister would secure legal assurances from the EU that the backstop would be temporary. The Leader of the House confirmed this, saying the Prime Minister is determined to get the legal reassurances that members want to see, while the Foreign Secretary told us the Prime Minister would find a way to win tomorrow's common vote by getting assurances with legal force that the Irish border backstop is only temporary. On receiving this letter today, to the Prime Minister from the President of the EU Commission and the Council, it must now be clear to all members across this House, yet again, the Prime Minister has completely and utterly failed to do that. Today's letter is nothing more than a repetition of exactly the same position that was pulled more than 1 month ago. It categorically does not give the legal assurances this House was promised and contains nothing but warm words and aspirations. Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that absolutely nothing has changed from the Attorney-General's letter of advice to the Cabinet? His advice, which the government tried to hide, explained with great clarity the reasons why the UK could find itself locked into the Northern Ireland backstop protocol with no legal escape route. Today's letter means nothing. The truth remains that by the end of 2020, the UK will face a choice of either extending the transition period, which comes at an unknown financial cost, or we will fall into the backstop, which the Attorney-General has said endures indefinitely until such time as an agreement supersedes it. He has himself updated his legal advice today, as the Prime Minister just said, and he clearly says, and I quote, "They do not alter the fundamental meanings as he advised them in November." If there were legally binding assurances on the temporary nature of the backstop, then surely they would have been written into the withdrawal agreement itself. The letter published this morning is clear that this is not possible, saying we're not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, this morning's joint letter does say negotiations can start as soon as possible after the withdrawal from the UK. But my question to the Prime Minister is, how is that possible when the Cabinet cannot agree it amongst themselves? That is why the political declaration is so vague. Actually, Mr. Speaker, I believe the right word is nebulous. Given the Prime Minister has failed to secure the promised changes, there can be no question of once again ducking accountability and avoiding tomorrow's vote. No more playing for time, no more running down the clock to scare people into backing this damaging shambles of a deal. I'm sure members across the House will not be fooled by what has been produced today. It's clear what we are voting on this week is exactly the same deal we should have voted on in December. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows this. That is why today she's trying to blame others for this chaos. Given the lack of support for the Prime Minister's deal, you might have thought she would try to reach out to MPs. Instead, the Prime Minister is claiming that by failing to support her botched deal, members are threatening to undermine the faith of the British people in our democracy. Mr. Speaker, the only people who are undermining faith in our democracy is the government itself. Mr. Speaker, I can think of no greater example of democracy in action than for this House to reject a deal that is clearly bad for this country. During the past 2 years of shambolic negotiations, the Prime Minister has failed to listen. She hasn't once tried to work with Parliament to construct a Brexit deal that this House and the country can support, and now she's left facing a humiliating defeat and is blaming everybody but herself. Mr. Speaker, if this deal is rejected tomorrow, and I hope it is, the blame will lie firmly with the government and firmly at the feet of the Prime Minister. There is a deal that could command support in the House, which would include a new and comprehensive customs union, a strong single market relationship, and a guarantee to keep pace with European Union rights and standards. Instead, the Prime Minister still chooses to take the most reckless path. Mr. Speaker, as we enter the week of the meaningful vote, we should remember the meaningful vote only happened because of pressure from the opposition in this House. Let us remember the incompetence we've been forced to endure. We've seen 2 years of shambolic negotiations, red lines announced, then cast aside. We're now on our third Brexit secretary, all of whom have been largely excluded from the vital stages of the negotiations. We were promised the easiest trade deal in history, yet we've seen a divided government deliver a botched withdrawal deal with nothing more than a vague outline for what our future relationship with the EU will be. Meanwhile, conditions in this country of millions of people continue to get worse. We just had an urgent question about universal credit and the disaster that is for millions of people in this country. Mr. Speaker, the government is in disarray. It's clear if the Prime Minister's deal is rejected tomorrow, it's time for a general election. It's time for a new government.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that there were many questions to me in the response that the right honourable gentleman gave, but let me respond to some of the points of facts that he referenced, some of which were perhaps not as correct as they might have been. He said, of course, there is no legal termination mechanism in the withdrawal agreement from on the backstop. There is, but the point is that it is not a unilateral termination mechanism. It is a termination mechanism which requires agreement between the two parties. He said that in December 2020 we would face either having the backstop or the implementation period extension. Of course, the point is we are negotiating to ensure that at that point no such choice will be necessary because we will have the future arrangement in place. He says that it's not possible to start the negotiations as soon as the withdrawal agreement, the meaningful vote has been held and agreement has been given to the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Indeed, Whitehall stands ready to start those negotiations. We have been looking at because we know the basis of those negotiations. It's in the political declaration, and everybody is ready to start those as soon as possible. He talked about at the end about universal credit. Can I just remind the right honourable gentleman that under this government, 3.4 million more jobs have been created. That means all those people able to earn a regular wage to help support their families. And under universal credit, we see a system that is helping people to get into the workplace rather than leaving them living on benefits for nearly a decade, as happened under the last Labour government. And finally, he calls, as he does regularly, for a general election. And here I think we saw yesterday that the right honourable gentleman isn't thinking about the national interest, he is merely playing politics. Because yesterday, when asked whether there was a general election, he would actually campaign to leave the European Union. He refused to answer that question 5 times. We know where we stand. We're leaving the European Union, and this government will deliver it.
Mr. Kenneth Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Prime Minister on getting rather further than I thought she would with the assurances and the letters that she's obtained. But I fear it will do no good because she's up against 2 bodies of opinion. One are the hardline Brexiteers on this side and the Leader of the Opposition and his front bench, who think if they cause crisis and deadlock, it will result in leaving with no deal. And the others is a lot of hardline Remainers, largely on the backbenches of the Labour Party, who think if they cause chaos and deadlock, it will lead to a second referendum. One of them is wrong. But the problem is she's up against both of them. Does she accept that if we lift our eyes from the present chaos and look to what the country needs, beyond our leaving the EU if the House of Commons insists on doing that, we need a permanently open border in Ireland for treaty and security reasons, and we need a permanently open border for economic reasons across the Channel for our trade and investment. And does she accept that it is difficult to proceed until there's some consensus for that across this House of Commons, and doesn't look as though we're going to get there by March the 29th, which is a date that should obviously be delayed?
All right, thank my right honourable and learned friend for his points and for his question. I don't believe that the date of the 29th of March should be delayed. I think my right honourable and learned friend sets out that there are those who want to see no deal and those who want to see a second referendum and potentially frustrate Brexit. The inexorable logic of that, if this House wants to ensure that we are delivering on Brexit for the British people, is to back the deal that will be before this House tomorrow. And on the issue of the borders and the question of obviously we want to make sure that there is a consistently and sustainably into the long term open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That is our commitment to ensure there is no hard border there. There would be economic advantage in an open border and frictionless trade with between the UK and the European Union, and that's exactly the proposal that the government has put forward.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement there. I'm left asking myself, is that it? Yep. Is that all you've got, Prime Minister? Because nothing has fundamentally changed. It is a wish list. Yep. With little more than 24 hours until this House votes on the Prime Minister's deal, the Prime Minister comes back completely humiliated. The letters published between the UK Government and the European Union reveal that the Prime Minister has utterly failed to get the concessions she promised. The EU letter explicitly insists there cannot be any renegotiation of the backstop or the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, the EU letter states we are not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. The Prime Minister is simply in fantasy land, presenting her statement as bringing changes when they are not. Mr. Speaker, this government must stop threatening no deal. It is time to face reality. Extend Article 50 and let the people decide. And let me say this to the Prime Minister. In Scotland, people know that it is the Tory government dragging Scotland out of the European Union against our will. It is the Tories treating the Scottish Parliament with contempt. And it is this Prime Minister and this Tory party that continues to silence Scotland's voice and sideline our interests. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister this morning said, what if we found ourselves in a situation where Parliament tried to take the UK out of the EU in opposition to a Remain vote? People's faith in the democratic processes and their politicians would suffer catastrophic harm. And yet, she is demanding precisely that in Scotland, taking Scotland out of the EU in opposition to an overwhelming Remain vote. To people in Scotland, the Prime Minister has made it clear that time and time again our voices are not to be listened to. The Prime Minister talks about respecting the results of referendums. The same Prime Minister who voted against Welsh devolution, who voted to wreck the Scottish devolution referendum as well. Mr. Speaker, this is a defining moment. The people of Scotland know more than ever that what comes from a Tory government that we did not vote for. So why does the Prime Minister continue to ignore Scotland's voices and Scotland's interests? Why is the Prime Minister so petrified of allowing the people decide? Now we know the facts. And if she's not, will she now do the right thing? Extend Article 50. Let the people decide.
Minister.
I say to the right honourable gentleman that the people across the United Kingdom did decide. They decided in June 2016. They decided that we should leave the European Union, and I believe it is absolutely right that this government is intent on committed to delivering on the vote of the British people. And he talks about the interests of Scotland. Of course, as he knows, the interests of Scotland are best served by ensuring that Scotland remains as part of the United Kingdom. And if the SNP is so clear that a politician should listen to the voice of the people, then the SNP should listen to the voice of the Scottish people expressed in the referendum in 2014 and abandon the idea of independence.
Sir John Redwood.
Given that the EU intends to take huge sums of money and powers off us in return for just 21 or 45 months of more talks and massive uncertainty, why should we ever believe the EU would give us a good deal when they pocket all that they want up front?
Prime Minister.
To my right honourable friend, that throughout the negotiations we have actually ensured that the European Union has had to concede to the United Kingdom government in a whole range of areas on which they did not wish to concede. But if we look into the future, I believe it is, and we do have, my right honourable friend and I do have a difference of opinion in this, in that he believes that WTO terms are right for our future trade with the European Union. I think a more ambitious free trade agreement between us and the European Union is what is right. That's what's set out in the political declaration, and that's what I believe is the good deal for the UK in leaving the EU.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Prime Minister's confirmed today that under her deal, Britain will remain between 2 and 4 years, possibly longer, in a customs union. The Leader of the Opposition is supporting Brexit with a somewhat longer period in a customs union. With that relatively small difference, aren't they essentially two peas in a pod?
Minister.
No, definitely not.
Sir William Cash.
Will my right honourable friend confirm what she said at Stoke today, namely that she will never extend the date of our leaving beyond the 29th of March this year, and never, in any circumstances whatsoever, allow the repeal of the Withdrawal Act and the European Community Act 1972 under that Act?
Prime Minister.
To my honourable friend, I did indeed confirm that I believe it is our intent, is what the government is working for, is to leave the European Union on the 29th of March. There are those who may try to find ways to prevent that from happening. I think that is a real risk, but the government is firm in its commitment in relation to leaving the European Union. And in relation to the issue that my honourable friend has raised on the Withdrawal Act, we have passed the Withdrawal Act through this House, through this Parliament. It does repeal the 1972 European Communities Act. Of course, for the period of the implementation period, it would be necessary within the WAB, as my honourable friend knows, to ensure that we are still able to maintain the rules that we need to operate by in order to abide by the negotiated agreement on the implementation period. But I can assure him it remains the commitment of this government to leave the European Union on the 29th of March.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is totally sincere in her sense of duty to this country and in her belief in her deal. But I want to turn her attention to something she doesn't want to contemplate, which is defeat tomorrow night. And I say to her in the strongest terms that the tone and substance she strikes in the wake of that eventuality will define her legacy to this country. And I want to urge her not to succumb to this absurd argument this is a war between this House and the government, when this government is a servant of this House. And I want to urge her also, Mr. Speaker, to, if she loses tomorrow night, give this House an open and honest process where it can express its view, and she and the government then becomes the servant of this House in the negotiation.
Prime Minister.
The government is a servant of the people. We are ensuring that we are delivering what the people want in relation to Brexit. Now, we've negotiated what I believe genuinely is a good deal for the United Kingdom, and that is why I will continue to encourage members of this House to support it.
Owen Paterson.
Speaker, it's absolutely clear the British government, the Irish government and the European Union always said there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And today's border works perfectly satisfactorily with electronic means. It is extraordinary and exasperating that we are still stuck on the question of the backstop when the Prime Minister has met technical experts who know that existing techniques and processes could deliver smooth delivery of that border. What meetings have been held since she met those experts prior to pulling the vote in December?
Minister. Right honourable friend, it is exactly those sorts of technological solutions that we are committed to pursuing. As I have said to my right honourable friend when he brought a proposal to me, the proposal he brought to me did not fully address all of the issues in relation to the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but we are continuing to look and will look actively and with the European Union at the ways in which we could ensure that those alternative arrangements would deal with the issue that we're addressing. But can I also say to my right honourable friend, it is not the case that the European Union has said that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The no-deal plans published by the European Commission in December make clear there will be no flexibility on border checks in no deal, so the Irish government would be expected to apply EU checks in full.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be fair to the EU, they have made it clear that there will be no changes to the withdrawal agreement, and there's nothing in these letters that is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. To be fair to the Attorney-General, he says in his letter today that the letters do not alter the fundamental meanings of its provisions. So 5 weeks since the Prime Minister pulled the vote saying that there had to be legally binding assurance, will she admit that nothing has fundamentally changed? I mean, that's the reality. Let's not kid ourselves about that. And will she not recognise that in pulling the vote, she must have realised that there needed to be legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement in order for it to have any chance of getting through this House? And even at this late stage, will she not accept that the problem with the backstop is that it effectively defines the future relationship for Northern Ireland, because if the whole of the UK is not aligned to a high degree for single market purposes and we're in a customs union, Northern Ireland will be.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that it's right that I took the views of this House, the overwhelming view of this House on the backstop was that people wanted to ensure that the backstop would not carry on indefinitely or be a permanent arrangement. The Right Honourable Gentleman has just indicated he thinks that is what the case is for the backstop. What we have received from the European Union are those further assurances and the recognition that the European Council conclusion, in which some of those assurances are referred to, does have legal force in international law and effectively sits alongside the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration package, and would be part of any consideration on any challenge to that withdrawal agreement in relation to those particular issues. But I recognise that what I have brought back, as I said in my statement, is not what some members wanted from the European Union. But it is not the case that this has not gone further than when we were initially discussing the debate. There have been some further assurances from the European Union, but I accept that those are not the same level of assurance that some members of this House wished.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right when she says that she's a servant of the people. There are 2 million young people who weren't able to vote back in 2016, 2.5 years ago. I'm so sorry that honourable members seem to, on this side, be in some way dismissing those young people. They are the future of our country. The Treasury's own analysis shows that whichever way you cut it, Brexit's going to make our country poorer. Why shouldn't they have a right to a say in their future, given they will bear the brunt of Brexit? Why tomorrow, when the Prime Minister's deal fails, why can't it go back to the British people so that everybody, especially young people, can have their say on their future, their say on Brexit?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend has asked me questions in relation to putting a decision back to the British people in the past, as have other honourable and right honourable members of this House, and referred to a new generation of young people who weren't able to vote in the 2016 referendum. But this House, this Parliament, was very clear that this was a decision to be taken in that referendum, and that government would abide by the decision that was taken in that referendum. And 80% of the votes cast at the last general election were for parties that said they would respect the result of the referendum. That I believe we should respect the result of the referendum and ensure that we deliver leaving the European Union.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. We will find out tomorrow evening whether the House is willing to support the Prime Minister's deal. But what is now clear is that the EU will not be able to offer her any further help, because as long as it continues to say we're not in a position to agree to anything that changes the withdrawal agreement, a number of her backbenchers will not be reassured. So while the Prime Minister will, for the next 26 hours at least, argue that we should back her deal, can I invite her today to commit, if she loses, to reach out across the House in order to try and find a way out of the crisis that is facing our country, that can command the support of Parliament, and that, if necessary, in order to do that, she should be willing to seek an extension to Article 50.
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, the House will give its view tomorrow night. I will be continuing to encourage members of this House to vote for what I believe to be a good deal. He might have noticed, actually, I have been meeting with and hearing from members across across the House in relation to this particular issue. I continue to believe that this is a good deal because it delivers on the referendum, and it is crucial that this House delivers on the referendum, but it also does so in a way that protects people's jobs and security and gives certainty to businesses, and that's why I believe it's a good deal.
Mr. Patrick McLaughlin.
No one is ever going to get what they want fully out of negotiations. But the very simple fact that all the leaders of our major industries, including Rolls-Royce, Toyota, JLR, have said that this deal is the right deal for them to continue winning markets and employing people in this country. Isn't that one of the most important decisions we should take in mind in trying to protect jobs, manufacturing jobs, and our country's future?
Well,
Minister.
Right honourable friend is absolutely right, but I would say to him it isn't just the leaders of manufacturing industry. He's absolutely right. They have made clear that this is a good deal and a deal that should be supported, but others have too. So we have seen Scottish fishermen, for example, we've seen farmers also saying that this is a deal that should be supported. And I think when members of the House think about the jobs of their constituents, it's important that they remember that.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
The Prime Minister comes hot foot from her speech in Stoke, where she commanded us to honour the result of the referendum. Yet, in 1997, she voted against legislation to establish the National Assembly of Wales, and in 2005 stood on a manifesto calling for another referendum with the option to overturn the result. How does the Prime Minister square her personal track record on referendums with such commands?
Prime Minister.
The Conservative Party, of course, we went into opposition in 1997. We accepted the result of the referendum vote in Wales. Yes. We respected and made clear at the time that we respected the result of that referendum in Wales. And I think anybody who sees the Welsh Assembly today and what it has been doing over recent years will recognise that was a right decision.
Mr. David Jones.
May I commend my right honourable friend for listening to the concerns of honourable members and for seeking to obtain further concessions and clarifications from the European Union. But is it not the case that the use of those words by Presidents Juncker and Tusk, that we are not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement, simply serves to underline those concerns and make it all the more likely that honourable members will reject the withdrawal agreement tomorrow?
I say to my right honourable friend that the concern that members had overwhelmingly raised was the issue of whether or not the backstop could continue indefinitely. The European Union, within the withdrawal agreement, in a number of ways, makes clear that the backstop can only be a temporary arrangement. They have given that further assurance in relation to this in Council conclusions, which have, as I say, a legal force in international law, and that has been confirmed here in the UK. So they have gone further than they did within the withdrawal agreement. But I've said to the House on many occasions, there is no deal with the European Union that does not involve a withdrawal agreement. There is no deal that does not involve having a backstop, as that commitment to the people of Northern Ireland that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Yvette Cooper.
The Prime Minister said this morning that she called on everyone to move beyond division and come together. Does she not recognise that she has made the divisions worse and made it harder for people to come together by not consulting either Parliament or the public on her red lines or the negotiating objectives, and by ducking and delaying votes? Does she not recognise that brinkmanship is the worst possible way to make such big decisions for the future of our country? And will she tell the House now that she has not ruled out extending Article 50 if her plan is rejected tomorrow?
I say to the right honourable lady, I have said on many occasions in this House, I have come regularly to this House and answered questions from honourable members about the position that the government has been taking on these particular matters, and I am clear, in fact it is in our legislation, that we should leave the European Union on the 29th of March this year.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Mr. Speaker, will my right honourable friend the Prime Minister reconfirm to the House that whatever future trading relationship the United Kingdom wishes to have with the European Union, this withdrawal agreement is clearly absolutely necessary to securing it?
Can I say that he is absolutely right. The point is there are two issues here. There's how we leave the European Union and what our future relationship is. And any trade agreement that we would need to wish to agree with the European Union will require us to have these details of the withdrawal agreement agreed. As I've said previously, any withdrawal agreement will include a backstop.
Looking for a new young member. Mr. Barry Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister to go back to that very good question asked by her colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, where he made a very intelligent plea for more time. This is one of the most important decisions that we will make, let alone this century, the last 100 years. Why should we rush it? It is complex. Her statement today shows how complex it is. We need more time. Why can't we have it?
Prime Minister.
The Right Honourable Gentleman, that it will be March 29th of this year will be almost 3 years since people voted for us to leave the European Union. This House voted overwhelmingly to trigger Article 50 in the knowledge that Article 50 had a set time for the process and that meant we would be leaving on a particular date.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The withdrawal agreement is, of course, a draft international treaty. And if we were to vote for it tomorrow and then ratify it, it would be binding upon us in international law. So it would outrank legally any motion or amendment of this House or even an act of Parliament. And the agreement says that itself, it confirms it in black and white in Article 4 on page 11. So the question is, do these letters have any legal power over the treaty? Now, the Prime Minister quoted from the Attorney General's advice, the operative paragraph 2, but if she'll forgive me, she quoted selectively. The paragraph, which is brief, reads, "I agree that in the light of this response, the Council's conclusions of the 13th December 2018 would have legal force in international law and thus be relevant and cognisable in the interpretation of the withdrawal agreement, and in particular the Northern Ireland Protocol, albeit they do not alter the fundamental meanings of its provisions as I advised them to be on the 13th of November 2018. In other words, the letters don't overrule the treaty. They're a fig leaf, and a small fig leaf at that. Isn't that true?
Prime Minister.
These are additional to the text that is in the treaty, and they do have force in international law. But I'd say to my right honourable friend, I was clear in my statement, and I have said that since, that I recognise that what we have from the European Union does not go as far as some members of this House would like it to go and would prefer it to go. But we do have those further assurances which would be, which sit alongside the withdrawal agreement, and in any position in which the question about the backstop within the withdrawal agreement was being challenged, these would be part of that consideration and would be, as has been said, they do have a force in international law.
Chris Leslie.
Just to be clear on the Prime Minister's strategy, she's asking us to trust her to agree to get past exit day before we even start to negotiate the whole of the future relationship between the EU and the UK. Doesn't she accept that would be a massive leap in the dark and anything could happen in that 2-year period? For example, who will be her successor concluding those negotiations?
Prime Minister.
Right Honourable Gentleman, that the political declaration sets out the instructions to the negotiators for the next stage in relation to not just the trade arrangements but also the security arrangements and indeed some issues underpinning all of these, for example the data, questions of data exchange. So those are the instructions on which the negotiators for the next stage will be working on that to change it into legal text. It is not possible for the EU to agree a legally binding text of a trade agreement with a country that is a member of the European Union. They have to wait until we are a third country and outside the European Union.
Greg Hans.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will have read the comments from leading EU Commission officials at the very highest levels about the withdrawal agreement since it was finalised. Sabine Vaillant, who is Michel Barnier's deputy, has said, first, this requires the customs union as the basis for the future relationship. She's also said they must align their rules, but the EU will retain all the controls. And finally, that the EU retains its leverage. Martin Selmayr, who's the General Secretary of the Commission, has said, quote, "The power is with us," and he told the Passauer Neue Presse on the 7th of December that the agreement shows that leaving the EU doesn't work. So Brussels clearly believes it's a great deal for them. Why does the Prime Minister seemingly as enthusiastic that this is a great deal for the United Kingdom?
First of all, can I say to my right honourable friend that what is clear in the letters that we've received today from the European Union is that the issues that form, I know a number of members were concerned about the phraseology that was in the political declaration about the future relationship in relation to customs and the phraseology of building on the protocol, and therefore the assumption that what was in the protocol was effectively going to have to be taken forward into that future relationship. In fact, the letters we have received today make clear that that is not the case. And I say to my right honourable friend, he asks why I believe this is a good deal. I believe it's a good deal because it does, as I've said previously, it does deliver on the vote of the referendum, control of money, borders and laws, out of the CFP, out of the CAP, but it also, and enabling us to have an independent trade policy, but it also enables us to do that in a way that protects jobs and security and gives certainty to businesses.
Yeah. Kate Hoey.
Speaker, I genuinely respect the Prime Minister's willingness to come back time after time to talk to this Parliament and to the public about her deal, even if today she hasn't really brought anything very different back, if we're honest. But could I ask her to state very clearly, this Parliament voted to give the people the opportunity to decide whether to leave or not to leave, not for this Parliament to decide. Will she therefore categorically state that whatever happens tomorrow night and whatever happens in the next few weeks, we will be leaving on March the 29th because that's what the people voted for?
Can I say to the right honourable lady, we will be leaving the European Union on March the 29th. I believe it is important that this Parliament delivers on the vote that people took in 2016. And indeed, as I've just said in response to one of her honourable friends, this Parliament voted to trigger Article 50 with that 2-year time frame that Article 50 had within it. But it is important, for the sake of our democracy, I believe, that we do deliver on the Brexit vote that took place in 2016.
Mary Cray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Wakefield on Saturday, Mr. Speaker, a man approached me to say that on the day the Prime Minister delayed the vote, his business lost a multi-million-pound contract, and as a result his order book was empty and the redundancies were now starting. So her delay has achieved nothing apart from the paradox of leaving her a little bit safer in her job, thanks to surviving a vote of no confidence, and my constituents quite a lot less safe in their jobs. So when her deal is voted down tomorrow, will she extend Article 50 and work across this House to give our constituents the option to vote again on what they now know is going to happen, which is continued uncertainty on the trading relationship between their businesses and the EU for at least the next 4 years?
What business is absolutely clear that the certainty that they require is the certainty that will be given by agreeing this deal.
Sir Desmond Swain.
To guarantee Brexit, she should prorogue Parliament until April. Tempting, isn't it?
Can I just say to my right honourable friend, he's trying to tempt me down a road that I don't think I should go down. But were Parliament to prorogue until April, I would be denied the opportunity to be able to see my right honourable friend and answer his questions on a regular basis, and that would be very sad.
George Howarth.
I accept, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister has tried her best. But doesn't she accept that everything she said today doesn't alter the fact that she has no majority in this Parliament, no authority in the country, and her government now serves no useful purpose?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, that, yes, the government is getting on with what we believe is right in putting a deal to this Parliament to deliver on Brexit and deliver for the British people. But can I also say to him that this isn't the only thing this government has been involved in? I would hope that when he talks about what the government has been doing, he would recognise the importance of the long-term plan for the National Health Service and the significant investment in the National Health Service which this government has agreed and is going to put in.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In her statement, my right honourable friend points out that the EU will not agree to an end date to the backstop or a unilateral exit mechanism. Does that make her doubt their sincerity when they say they don't really want the backstop?
Prime Minister.
To my honourable friend, that the concern that the European Union has about those two options are, as I said in my statement, that somehow the United Kingdom would try to engineer a situation where it simply pulled out and erected, and there was a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. They want to guarantee that there is will be no such hard border. Now, I have said to the European Union, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. We want to guarantee that commitment to the people of Northern Ireland because it's important, because they are part of the United Kingdom. But the European Union has been clear that in every circumstance, whatever the trade agreement that was negotiated in the future, whatever the withdrawal agreement, that they would require a backstop to be part of that. What we can do is ensure that we get the future relationship in place such that the backstop is never needed, and that were it to be needed, it was only temporary. It's getting that future relationship in place which enables us to ensure the long-term sustainability of the guarantee that we've given to the people of Northern Ireland.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In spite of what we heard from the Prime Minister just a few minutes ago, the Prime Minister was one of 144 Tory MPs who voted against the foundation of the Welsh Assembly back in December 1999. That was 18 months after the referendum result. Why was it acceptable for her to do that then, but conversely ruling out today the opportunity for this country, including 2 million young people who didn't have a say back in 2016, to have that people's vote on the actual terms of the withdrawal agreement?
I didn't answer the specific point about young people when my right honourable friend, the member for Backstop, raised that question. So I would like to address it now. Because I recognise that there are people today who are now eligible to vote who weren't eligible to vote in 2016. But I have to say to those members who say that that is a reason for having a second vote, actually, regardless of how that vote went, then people could say in 2 years' time there's another group of young people who should be voting, and therefore we should have another vote. No, Parliament was clear. The decision on 2016 was a decision that would be delivered.
Victoria Prentice.
Tempting as it is to sex up international law by talking about fig leaves, could the Prime Minister confirm to me that the status of these letters from the EU today is legally binding if we were to have, say, an arbitration under international law in the future?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, and I'm very happy to respond to my honourable friend, who, of course, with her legal experience, has rather more experience of these matters than I do. But it is right, they do have that legal force. They would be taken into account in looking at any arbitration, any dispute that arose. This would be part of the consideration that would be taken into account. So they do have that legal force.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I gently say to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, that whatever our views in Brexit across this House, we're all patriots, and it is not subversive to take a different view from the Prime Minister. It is simply democracy in action. And it's not subversive because otherwise the position that the Prime Minister and indeed the Conservative Party took for nearly 8 years after Welsh devolution would also have been subversive. It wasn't, it was just a different point of view. I'm very proud the Welsh Assembly is in my constituency and it's there today. But would the Prime Minister agree with me there was a fundamental difference between Welsh devolution and Brexit? Support for Welsh devolution grew. That's why she wasn't successful in her call for another referendum or abolishing the Welsh Assembly. Support for Brexit has fallen, and that is exactly why we need to put it back to the people.
I'm afraid the underlying... I don't accept the underlying premise of the honourable gentleman's question, that he thinks that support for Brexit has fallen. There are indeed there are indeed people who say that they voted leave but they would now vote to remain. There are also people who say they voted remain who would now vote to leave the European Union. And the overwhelming view that I get when I knock on doors and hear from people directly is actually that they just want the government to get on with the job that people gave to the government of leaving the EU.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you very much. Last week, the Shadow Brexit Secretary implied that he supported much of the withdrawal agreement, but he would vote against it because he wanted more clarity on the long-term relationship. But the EU has made it clear that we can't get the clarity on the long-term relationship before the withdrawal agreement. The horse has to come before the cart. Does she agree that it is the party opposite who are therefore being reckless in jeopardising our chances to move on with the negotiations before Europe shuts for its elections?
My honourable friend has made a very important point about the timing. We have the opportunity in agreeing this withdrawal agreement and political declaration to start those negotiations, to get that work going before those European parliamentary elections which take place in the summer. And it is indeed right that the EU cannot negotiate that legally binding text and sign up to that legally binding text until we're outside of the European Union, but are willing to start those negotiations so that we can ensure that we're in the best place possible to deliver the future relationship in December 2020.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Prepared to hold this House to ransom. She knows she will lose the vote tomorrow and still insists on a March the 29th exit date, in spite of calls to extend Article 50. Would she really want to see this country crash out of the EU with all the losses of jobs and business that go with that?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I've been very clear that if people want to avoid no deal, then what they should be doing is supporting this deal, which businesses like BAE Systems, which the honourable gentleman I'm sure will know, have said is a good deal and should be supported.
John Barron.
I'm just aware that many of us have wished her well in these negotiations, but in the absence of any legal certainty about the UK's right to unilaterally leave the backstop, something my Amendment F seeks to address, what certainty is there that the EU doesn't drag out the trade negotiations so that in, say, 5 years' time, we're still discussing the issue?
Can I say to my honourable friend, and he and I have discussed this previously, the European Union do not see the situation that would exist where the trade negotiations were continuing for some considerable time, and if it were the case that the backstop had come into place, as a good place for the European Union. Tariff-free access to EU markets without paying any money, with no free movement of people and with no access for EU boats to our fishing waters is not a good place for the European Union to be in. As I explained, the reason why they're concerned about the idea of a unilateral exit mechanism is because they do not want to see a situation in which the UK pulled out of the backstop and left the creation of a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And my honourable friend, I suspect, doesn't trust the European Union not to try to keep us in this backstop. They don't. Their concern is about whether they can trust us not to effectively leave a situation where there's a hard border, and it's finding a compromise between those two that we can all have confidence in that we've been working at.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister claims the possibility of no Brexit would be a subversion of democracy. Isn't it true that the real subversion of democracy is a Prime Minister who has consistently sought to shut Parliament out of this process from the very beginning, who now refuses to go to the people to see if they are still satisfied with a deal that bears no resemblance to the one that was promised them 2.5 years ago? So why will she not go to the people? Why is she so afraid to put her deal to the people? If they still like it, then they will vote for it, but if they don't, they should have the right to remain.
I think when people voted in the referendum in 2016, they wanted to, in the words that were used at the time that I've used since, they wanted control of our borders, of our money and our laws. This deal delivers on that. They wanted us to be able to have an independent trade policy. This deal delivers on that. They wanted us to be out of the CAP and the CFP. This deal delivers on that. And I think we should be delivering what people voted for in 2016.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend for standing firm on the date? And does she agree with me that, bearing in mind the track record of the EU and the difficulty we've had to negotiate anything like a fair trade deal, the only way we will actually achieve one is when we leave the EU, regain our sovereignty and sit down and discuss properly with them a fair trade deal, which I am convinced personally we will reach, and very quickly.
I say to my honourable friend, we have the outline of that trade agreement, of that fair trade, free trade deal with the European Union. We've set that out in the political declaration. We have the opportunity and the commitment to ensure that that can be put in place by December 2020 by agreeing the withdrawal agreement and the package with the political declaration. I believe that's the right thing to do.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Parliament voted in favour of 2 amendments tabled from the backbenchers, from my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, and also from the right honourable and learned gentleman from Beaconsfield. The support for these amendments, against the wishes of the government, make clear that Parliament does not support leaving the European Union without a deal. The Prime Minister said in her statement just now that no deal would mean no implementation period, no security arrangements in place, no certainty for businesses and workers, and would put the future of Northern Ireland at risk. So given how catastrophic the Prime Minister accepts that a no-deal Brexit would be, will the Prime Minister now rule it out and instead look to extend Article 50 if and when Parliament rejects her deal tomorrow?
It's very simple. Either you have no deal or you have a deal. The deal that is on the table is a good deal for the UK, and the EU has made clear it is the deal.
Helen Grant.
The Prime Minister is working extremely hard and robustly in the best interests of the people of this country. And does she agree with me that our democracy will be damaged if we do not deliver on Brexit?
Well, yes, I do agree with my honourable friend, because I believe that the British people, and many people who voted in the referendum in 2016 hadn't voted before or hadn't voted for some considerable time. And I think their faith in politics, and indeed the faith of all those who voted to leave the EU in politics, would be damaged if we don't deliver on that. And I think it's very simple. We asked the people what their view was. We said we would do what they decided, and we should now do it.
Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was the Prime Minister's absolute conviction in 2017 that it wasn't in the country's interest to hold a general election. It is now the Prime Minister's absolute conviction that we will secure a legal deal setting out our future relationship with the EU by December 2022 at the latest, albeit 6.5 years after the Brexit vote. Why should we believe the Prime Minister?
The commitment to that and the determination to reach that point isn't simply something that I've said. It is there in the documents. It's a commitment from the UK government and the European Union.
Johnny Elphick.
Will the Prime Minister confirm that whatever tactics used by the party opposite, whatever Trump-style shutdown threats of government finances that they may bring to this House, that she is determined that we should leave the European Union on the 29th of March? And does she also agree that while no deal wouldn't be ideal, it wouldn't be the end of the world either?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, as I said earlier today, of course, there would be damage to the economy. There would be an impact. There would be consequences of no deal, and I've set those out. Now, over time, the UK could recover from that. But I believe what is important, as my honourable friend says, is that we do deliver that leaving the European Union. And I am concerned about attempts that could be made to try and find ways of effectively rejecting the vote that the British people took in 2016. I believe we should deliver Brexit, and this government will do so.
Peter Kyle.
Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has said that she listened to the previous debate and withdrew the vote so that she could focus on the backstop. But the truth is that concerns about trade and Dover were raised 3 times more than the backstop. What negotiations has she had with the EU about trade and the border in Dover in the last few weeks? And what changes has she brought back to the House?
What the political declaration sets out is an ambitious trade arrangement with the European Union for the future. It sets out very clearly a number of specifics in relation to the customs arrangements across the border between the United Kingdom and the European Union, the various points in which that border is. And of course, what we now see is a clear commitment from the European Union to the nature of that political declaration and the fact that it is part of the package with the withdrawal agreement.
Rachel McLean.
Will the Prime Minister provide assurances to the distribution, the exporting, the technological and the manufacturing businesses in my Redditch constituency that if and when, as I hope it will be, this deal is passed, she will move quickly to put in place our future arrangements to give them the certainty that they need, and most importantly, their employees for my constituents?
My honourable friend raises a very important point, that we should consider those businesses, those employers and the constituents who are employed by them. And indeed, I will move quickly. Once, it's clear now from the EU, once the withdrawal agreement has had the agreement of this House, then we can sit down and start that work of putting that future relationship in place such that it is there at the end of the implementation period and there is a smooth and orderly exit for businesses and their employees in this country.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, in May 2012, the government asked the people of Sheffield to vote in a referendum as to whether or not they wanted a city mayor. Sheffield rejected that by 65%, but the government went on to impose a mayoral model 3 years later. Why is it right for the government to ignore the wishes of the people in one referendum, but to also say that they're going to abide by the decision in a referendum in another?
Say to the honourable lady that in 2016, as part of the campaign for the referendum, the government, which had a position that it was supporting Remain in the European Union, sent out a leaflet to every household in the United Kingdom in which it clearly said that it would abide by the decision of the referendum.
David Duquette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that, contrary to the assertions made by President Macron and others, that in the undesirable event for both sides of a backstop, there will be no more common access to our waters for EU fishing vessels?
Yes, I can confirm that to my honourable friend. What is clear is that if no agreement has been reached on this matter, then there will be no access to our waters for EU boats in the circumstances in which the backstop is in place. It's one of the reasons why the European Union will not consider it to be a good place for them.
It is what it's through.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech, she said that the future agreement with the EU would be concluded by the time the Article 50 process had finished. That was to be used for businesses to implement that deal during the transition period. That's now not the case, is it?
We have very clearly the framework for that future relationship in the political declaration. We have the commitment that we can start that work on that quickly, and we have the implementation period for businesses.
Maggie through.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for her determination to secure a deal that protects jobs across Erewash? Can she also confirm that the EU 27 have committed to work at a rapid pace to get future trade deals in place so we will never need the backstop?
Yes, this is one of the things that we now see confirmed by the European Union, that is indeed their commitment. They want to ensure that we can work together so that we get that future relationship in place at the end of the implementation period and the backstop need never be used.
Does the Prime Minister recognise that by threatening members of Parliament with a democratic catastrophe if we vote against her job-destroying deal, she is embracing not only the hand of President Trump, but his methods? And would she now say explicitly, and for the benefit in particular of those threatening members of Parliament online and on our streets, that she agrees
that for her government to lose tomorrow's vote does not undermine democracy. On the contrary, it shows that no one, and particularly not this failing government, is above our parliamentary sovereignty.
First of all, what I have said would undermine democracy, and I'm clear would undermine democracy, is a failure of this Parliament to deliver on the vote of the British people and to deliver Brexit. But I must say to the Honourable Lady, first of all, can I say to the Honourable Lady that I have absolutely no trust. There should be none of the sort of behaviour that we have seen online or physically in relation to members of this House or other members of the public on their views on the European Union. This is very serious. The way in which that aggressive and vicious attitude has been taken is absolutely wrong. But can I also say to her, this is a deal that protects jobs. What would have a negative impact on jobs is to leave the European Union without a deal.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, much of the concern about the Northern Ireland backstop is to do with trust. So could the Prime Minister confirm my understanding of one of the reassurances she's achieved, which is that even if EU member states haven't ratified a future trade agreement, that trade agreement would still be applied in order to avoid the backstop, meaning that we would not be hostage to any regional parliament like the Walloons or anywhere else that the Canadian agreement was?
My honourable friend is right. It is normal practice in trade agreements to enable them to be brought into place provisionally while ratification processes are being undertaken. And it is, we have been clear that that is what we would do, and the Commission is clear that they would recommend that that is what the European Union should do, such that the trade agreement could be put in place, the backstop wouldn't need to be used, and it would not be hostage to those ratification processes.
Chris Bright.
Downing Street has repeatedly briefed that the Prime Minister is intending to support the amendments tabled by her honourable friends from East Devon and South West Wiltshire tomorrow afternoon. But earlier on in this process, the government argued very forcefully that any amendment to the motion under the EU Withdrawal Act would mean that it was impossible for the government to ratify the treaty. So if she's supporting amendments tomorrow, she is arguing that she should not be allowed to ratify the treaty. Surely that can't be right. Surely it's time that she came clean and just decided it's either we vote in favour or we vote against tomorrow.
Can I first of all say to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, nobody yet knows what amendments the Speaker will choose to have for debate and vote tomorrow, for voting tomorrow. But the point about the ratification of the withdrawal agreement bill when that comes, ratification of the treaty as in the withdrawal agreement bill when that comes through, is that that bill needs to obviously to reflect what is in the withdrawal agreement. But a number of issues have been raised by honourable members across this House. The ones that he has referred to, also issues around workers' rights, where we have the ability to give further confidence to members of this House in a way which does not actually impact on the ratification of the treaty. No, it doesn't.
I believe I'm on
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whatever option people want to see for the future relationship, other than actually remaining in the EU, there will need to be some sort of agreement with the European Union. And that will mean money, citizens' rights and some guarantees around the Northern Ireland border. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that just kicking the can down the road, as some people want to do opposite, isn't going to change any of those issues?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Any agreement that we have is going to contain those elements, and we have those elements in the deal that is before us. And I think suggestions that all we need to do is somehow just take longer and longer and longer is not right. And I think the British people would turn around and say, 3 years on, we need to leave.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker. In December 2017, in response to a question from myself, Prime Minister, you stated that Northern Ireland would never be treated differently in relation to the single market and the customs union. I welcomed that reply. And today, Prime Minister, you referred to yourself as a proud unionist. However, tomorrow, the 15th of February, the withdrawal agreement has changed that, and Northern Ireland will be treated very differently from the rest of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. This time, the unionism that the Prime Minister has put forward has been weakened? Will the Prime Minister reiterate the unionism of December 2017 and not her watered-down and false version of February 2019?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, as he will have noted, we published a document last week in relation to Northern Ireland, which confirms the commitments we've given on one of the issues that has been of concern and been raised by the honourable gentleman and his honourable and right honourable colleagues in the DUP about the difference in regulation, potential difference in regulation between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And we're clear about the commitment that we would give in relation to that situation, such that we did not see that difference occurring in the circumstances in which the backstop was put in place. I believe firmly in the union of the United Kingdom, and everything I do, I want to do to ensure that we maintain the union of the United Kingdom. There are, of course, some differences in treatment already for Northern Ireland in relation to some of the laws. Those are of significance in some of the areas in which they operate. But, of course, in the future, we have given that commitment to ensure we don't have that divergence.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very appreciative of the seemingly tireless efforts of the Prime Minister in negotiating the withdrawal agreement. But with regard to the backstop protocol, is it not the case that because we cannot unilaterally leave that backstop if it came into force, we are effectively ceding sovereignty, not taking back control?
My honourable friend is absolutely right that there is no unilateral right to exit that mechanism. There is, of course, a termination mechanism within the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, but that does, of course, relate to both sides agreeing that. And it's because of this fundamental point of ensuring that at every stage there is that guarantee that there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But the backstop need not come in place by the future relationship being put in place by the end of December 2020. Even if there was a need for something at that stage, it would be possible for this Parliament, and we've been clear it would be this Parliament, to choose whether to go down the route of an extension of the implementation period instead. But I believe the best thing for us to do is to work to ensure that the future relationship comes in place with a long-term and sustainable guarantee of no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Chris Ruane.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has just informed the House that she and her party accepted and respected the Welsh referendum devolution vote in 1997. If this is the case, can I ask the Prime Minister, why did the Tory manifesto of 2005 call for a further referendum on Welsh devolution, including an option to abolish the Welsh Assembly?
This year.
I say to the honourable gentleman that we did, when the vote took place on Welsh devolution, we said that we accepted that vote and we accepted the devolution, and of course we did look beyond that to extending the powers of the Welsh Assembly, and this government has extended the powers of the Welsh Assembly.
Stephen Kerr.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend the Prime Minister agree that any failure of this House to comply with the instruction of the people to take this country out of the European Union in an orderly way will play right into the hands of those who wish to destroy our precious union and wish to break up our United Kingdom?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I think he's absolutely right. I think what people want to see is leaving the European Union, but doing it in a way which is orderly, which is smooth, which is, does not disrupt people's jobs and livelihoods, and that to do it in any other way would indeed be a threat to the Union of the United Kingdom.
Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from my colleague for Newcastle, over the weekend we've seen a very disturbing increase in threats of violence to colleagues. And would the Prime Minister agree with me that it's important that we all are mindful about our language, particularly when discussing parliamentary procedures and no deal and its consequences, because we are at risk of widening these divisions that we've worked so hard to close, enabling a space where the far right and their followers can step in.
Can I say to the honourable lady that I absolutely agree there is no place for these kinds of threats and the abuse and harassment that takes place, that has been sadly taking place. Members of this House, indeed members of the public, should be able to hold different opinions and hold those different opinions passionately and debate those different opinions with passion and with vigour, and be able to do that without the threat of physical violence or without the sort of harassment and bullying that has happened online.
Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has said the assurances that she has from the European Union would give legal certainty and clarity. If there is a dispute in that matter in relation to what is in the withdrawal agreement, who will be the final arbiter on that? Will that go to Article 174 for the ECJ to look at European law? Who will be the arbiter on that?
The arbiter would be the arbitration panel. That is, there is a process of governance that is set out within the arrangements that we have set out in the withdrawal agreement, and indeed looking ahead for the future relationship under the political declaration.
Sorry. Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's been reported that Ireland has gained more than 5,000 jobs, including one assumes those created by a move of the firm set up by the Prime Minister's own right honourable member for North East Somerset, due to what the firm states as considerable uncertainty and increased costs due to Brexit. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is all the proof needed for why Scotland's best interests lie in being an independent member state of the EU?
Scotland's best economic interests, and I suggest to the honourable gentleman that he looks at the figures. Scotland's best economic interests are met by remaining a member of the United Kingdom.
Marshal Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, given today's joint letter to the Prime Minister from the Presidents Juncker and Tusk, saying that the EU are not in a position to agree anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement, isn't it the case the Prime Minister has achieved nothing since pulling the meaningful vote on December the 10th, and in her own words, nothing has changed?
The withdrawal agreement, the concern, as I said earlier in response to a number of honourable members, that was expressed was ensuring that the... I'm trying to answer the honourable lady's question. The response that the concern that people had here within the House overwhelmingly was one of ensuring that backstop would be temporary if it ever came into place. That is in with the withdrawal agreement already, but the further assurances that we have received further confirm that, and as I've said, the December Council conclusions do have legal force.
Kevin Ollinwright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a speech of 11th October last year, Michel Barnier stated that in the event of no deal, there will be checks at the border for all live animals and products of animal origin. Isn't this potentially disastrous for Northern Ireland and for the integrity of the United Kingdom?
Yeah, can I say to my honourable friend, he is absolutely right. I think there are some who have felt that the European Union would not require such checks, but the EU have been clear that they would require checks in the circumstances of no deal.
Anna Turley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I admire the Prime Minister's efforts to try and contort her deal over the backstop to try and get it over the line and get it passed, but surely she must be stepping back now and looking at the bigger picture, which is that her deal and any version of it is still a betrayal of what people voted for. Her deal is not what people voted for in 2016. So much has changed. It's time to go back to them with the truth now and ask them for their view.
I think what people voted for in 2016 was to ensure that the ECJ jurisdiction ended in the UK. Their deal delivers that. It was to ensure that free movement would come to an end. The deal delivers that. It was to ensure that we didn't continue sending significant sums of money to the European Union every year, and the deal delivers on that.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shouldn't anyone in any party who purports to be concerned with the positive future relationship with the European Union, preserving our union with Scotland and protecting our union with Northern Ireland, now stop playing politics and vote for her deal, because failure to do so is going to let genie out of bottles which are very much best kept corked?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that I believe that it is important that people, believe it is important that people support this deal, because it does deliver on the referendum, it does protect the union, and it does protect jobs and security.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All but 4% of Hull North constituents who've contacted me have asked me to vote down the Prime Minister's deal, including many leavers. So does the Prime Minister think that's because they no longer support Brexit, or because they think what they want is to have the promises that were made in the Leave campaign delivered on, and that this doesn't do it?
As I said, obviously there was a vigorous campaign during the referendum. I think, as I've just said in response to one of her honourable friends, I believe when people voted, they voted to take back control of money laws and borders. That is what this deal delivers, alongside the other things that people were concerned about, like leaving the CAP and leaving the CFP and having an independent trade policy.
Matt Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Sunday Times was in Boston to take the temperature of the most heavily Leave voting town in the country on Saturday. And what they heard in a genuinely random sampling of people in the marketplace was that my constituents understood that the wind was in the sails of those who want to stop Brexit. And while I can't pretend that I was overwhelmed with love for the Prime Minister's deal, what they did say to me was that it is back this or see no Brexit, and that would be anathema to British democracy.
Well, I'm interested in the views that were expressed in Boston at the weekend. Can I say to my honourable friend that I agree, and I think it is absolutely right that this government delivers on the vote of the British people, and people are becoming increasingly concerned about the possibility of there being attempts to try and thwart that Brexit, frustrate that Brexit, or indeed stop that Brexit.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The complexity of these islands is summed up, Mr. Speaker, in the Good Friday Agreement, allowing and recognising a diversity of identity. And on the 22nd of October, the Prime Minister on the floor of the House assured me that the right to be both British and Irish, or both, is secure. Yet today, Mr. Speaker, those seeking to retain their Irish identity are having to officially renounce a British identity they never had at a cost of £372, are having their freedom of movement limited for up to 6 months, and are even having citizens within Northern Ireland having their residency questioned. Can the Prime Minister assure me and people like Emma de Souza and those of Northern Irish background in my constituency that the Prime Minister's government is not using Brexit to undermine the fundamentals and complexities of the benefits of the Good Friday Agreement?
We are indeed ensuring that the Brexit arrangements that we have negotiated with the European Union abide by the commitments in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And within the withdrawal agreement, as was indicated in the December joint report, it is very clear that that point of nationality that the honourable gentleman has raised is referenced, and it's clear that that is that ability for people within Northern Ireland to identify as British or Irish is in there.
Bill Wiggin.
Sat through this entire statement, Mr. Speaker, and many before it. And can I just commend the Prime Minister for keeping her temper, for the polite way in which she has answered every question when it must be infuriating sometimes for her to do so. And can she just reassure me that if things don't go quite to plan tomorrow, she will still apply that fantastic British grit that she's determined to how we leave under WTO?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, of course, I'm working to make sure that things do go in the right way tomorrow, but I can assure him that whatever I do and whatever happens, I will be working in the national interest with the determination that I have always had of ensuring we deliver for this country.
Dr. Rupa Hart.
Because small businesses with no time, energy or resources for no-deal planning are appalled to see the Phantom Ferry Company's government contract, the Kent Lorry Park experiment and the swathes of civil servants now given over to some sort of Dad's Army-style wargaming troops on our streets. So can the Prime Minister tell us, by running down the clock and not ruling out no deal, how much has her blackmail Brexit cost the taxpayer to date and since December the 11th?
Well said, well said.
The honourable lady that she will know the sums of money that have been made available by the Treasury to departments across government to provide for both no-deal preparations and the preparations for a deal. It is entirely right that we take those contingency arrangements to ensure that we have made the decisions and put into place the operations that are necessary should there be a no deal.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that all deals would require a backstop of some sort? And as unpalatable as this deal is, and this backstop is, there is simply no such thing as a painless, risk-free backstop. So if not this backstop, another backstop would be required, perhaps as dangerous, or if not more concerning, as this one.
Friend is absolutely right. It is clear that whatever the agreement was reached with the European Union, a backstop would be required. And some people talk about a different trade agreement for the future, but it would be necessary because that would require negotiation to ensure that there was a backstop there for the circumstances in which that new agreement wasn't able to come into place at the end of the implementation period. There is no agreement without a backstop.
Deirdre Brock.
A survey of 120 SMEs and stakeholders by Harvard researchers concluded that for most companies, the May deal is inferior to remaining in the EU or a much closer relationship with the EU that includes continued participation in the single market. We still respect experts in Scotland, Mr. Speaker. When will she follow their advice, fulfil the people of Scotland's vote in the EU referendum and protect our place in the single market and the customs union?
What we have negotiated with the European Union, what is set out in the political declaration, is the most ambitious trade relationship with any third country that the EU has ever negotiated. It is one which does see a good customs arrangement, good access to market. Protection of jobs was one of the things that I wanted to ensure we were doing in the deal that we negotiated, and it does just that.
If you're interested, I can see details about it.
So on the
Prime Minister agree with me that, can I thank her for meeting a group of MPs from all parts of the House with manufacturing constituencies last week? And can I say to her and ask her if she would agree that with the assurances that have now come forward from the EU, and bearing in mind that the overwhelming message from that meeting was that manufacturing business doesn't want a no-deal situation, which would be highly disruptive. And this was coming from both sides of industry, this message through the meeting. Does she agree with me that really voting for the deal is the way forward?
Say to my right honourable friend, he's absolutely right, of course. In that meeting, what was very clear was a number of members of this House from across the House, in conversation and discussion with manufacturing industry, recognised the importance of ensuring that we protected jobs and the potential impact that no deal could have on those jobs. I believe this is a good deal because it does deliver on the referendum, but it does protect jobs.
Emma Little-Pengelly.
Mr. Speaker, despite these letters today, can the Prime Minister confirm that it remains the legal position that the UK cannot enter into the extension period without the explicit agreement of the European Union, that we cannot avoid going into the backstop unless we have the explicit agreement of the European Union for an alternative, and once in the backstop, we cannot legally withdraw from that without the explicit agreement of the European Union?
Yeah, that's right.
As I've said to members of the House previously, when they've referred specifically to the last of those points on the unilateral withdrawal mechanism, there is no unilateral withdrawal mechanism. The United Kingdom can make the choice, and we're clear that Northern Ireland, Stormont should have a voice in that choice as to whether to go into the backstop or the implementation period. But the reason why that unilateral exit mechanism is not there is because the European Union has a concern that the United Kingdom, we are clear that we would not do this, but that the United Kingdom might use that unilateral exit mechanism to put Northern Ireland and Ireland in a situation where there was a hard border.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister clearly cannot get her deal through tomorrow night, and her Foreign Secretary conceded as much last week despite the false choice we had been offered. Meanwhile, the Leader of the Opposition wants to call an election in the hope that, like Micawber, something will turn up. And it gives me no pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to say that I am beginning to think that perhaps we all might as well wait to see if a mermaid riding a unicorn will happen by and provide a solution given how things are going. But does she not think that a sensible way forward would be to, at long last and finally, to listen to the majority of the Scottish people, reject Brexit and this entire shambles once and for all?
Yeah.
I think the sensible way forward is to deliver on Brexit for the British people and to do it with the deal that's been negotiated with the EU.
Paul Sweeney.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister received a letter that I and many other colleagues across parties in this House have signed, warning against the impact that a no-deal Brexit would have on our industries, particularly our manufacturing industries that rely on very sensitive supply chains across the European continent. It's clear that faced with this dilemma tomorrow night of a deal that is dead in the water and then the default back to a no-deal situation is not countenanceable, and the Prime Minister cannot, in all consciousness, entertain any scenario where no deal is a possibility. It is in the duty of the Prime Minister now to rule out no deal once and for all under any circumstances. It is not in the national interest. The Prime Minister should not countenance it under any circumstances.
I'm not asking Parliament to vote for no deal. I'm asking Parliament to vote for the deal that ensures that we avoid no deal.
That's fine. Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Speaker, the Prime Minister has agreed the backstop as an insurance policy. Insurance policies usually protect, but according to her own MPs, this leaves the UK vulnerable. Prime Minister, no one would even take out a car insurance policy that leaves them vulnerable. So whose insurance is it, and has she agreed to pay for the other driver's policy?
The point of the backstop as an insurance policy is it's a guarantee that in all of the circumstances that have been set out, that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So it is a guarantee for people in Northern Ireland and for people in Ireland. I've been clear that the United Kingdom government would not erect a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but as I've indicated and as has been clear from a number of questions that have come today, the European Commission has also been clear that in a no-deal scenario, the checks at the border would be expected.
Hugh Gaffney.
Prime Minister, at 11th hour, you decided to contact the trade unions of Great Britain, who represent the workers who create the wealth for this country. Did you get a good response?
I had positive discussions with trade union leaders and a positive discussion with the chairman of the CBI.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has said that these written assurances have legal standing and legal force and that they would be taken into account. But she's also acknowledged that paragraph 2 of the Attorney-General's letter of advice says that they do not alter the fundamental meaning of the provisions of the withdrawal agreement. So can she confirm that ultimately, as a matter of law, in any conflict between the wording of these assurances and the wording of the withdrawal agreement would triumph, and therefore, in the months since she pulled the meaningful vote, nothing has changed?
Say to the Honourable Lady that she says that it is my claim that these assurances have legal force. Obviously it is the European Union that has been clear that they have legal force, and as she has said, the Attorney-General himself has said that they would have legal force in international law and thus be relevant and cognisable in the interpretation of the withdrawal agreement.
Mike Gapes.
Speaker, the Prime Minister referred to subversion of our democracy. In our parliamentary democracy, no parliament can bind its successor. It was not this Parliament that agreed to hold a referendum or to prematurely trigger Article 50. It was the previous Parliament. And if she's talking about subversion of democracy, was her calling of a general election that she lost in 2017 a subversion of democracy?
Can I just gently point out to the honourable gentleman that actually the Conservative Party is in government in this country and that we will deliver on the referendum for 2016.
Alison Hewlett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister and this government have been engaging in acts of outright fudgery, that is the spreading of fear, uncertainty and doubt, with the bizarre spectacle of the Financial Secretary to the Treasury running up and down with planted notes saying no food and no Channel Tunnel. Mr. Speaker, is it no surprise to the Prime Minister that people in Scotland watching this ridiculous spectacle are starting to think we could do a lot better running things ourselves?
say it is entirely right that we are taking those mitigation measures in relation to no deal to ensure that we can deal with that consequences were that to be the situation in which we found ourselves. But can I say to the honourable lady, she and a number of her colleagues talk about listening to the voice of the people, as her right honourable friend, the leader of the SNP here in Westminster did earlier in his intervention. Listening to the voice of the people means accepting the result of the 2014 Scottish referendum.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I press the Prime Minister on the tone of the debate and ask what actions being taken by leaders in all different parts of the opinion of Brexit to ensure that a sense of people versus parliamentarians is not encouraged?
Yes, well said.
To the honourable lady, I think it is in the hands of all of us in this House to show that we are respecting the vote of the people, that we are respecting the views that people gave in 2016, and that the debate is about how we deliver on that vote. I think that's very important for everybody across this whole House.
Albert Owen.
Speaker, if regulatory alignment is good enough for Northern Ireland, then it's good enough for Wales, good enough for Scotland and good enough for England. And for that reason, I'll be voting against her deal tomorrow, because we want a level playing field in the United Kingdom. Moreover, 88% of constituents who have contacted me reject her deal. Many young people, 75%, think they'll be worse off with Brexit. Now the Prime Minister has been exposed to having former voted against the will of the Welsh people in the election and standing on a manifesto to overturn it, can she at this 11th hour give the people the vote and have a final say on Brexit?
And say to the honourable gentleman that the people were given a vote. They were given a vote by Parliament. Parliament agreed. The government at that time said that that decision would be respected, and I believe we should do so.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I plead with the Prime Minister to mind her language? Because the use of the term in her statement to say that people's opinions would represent a subversion of our democracy is completely unnecessary at a time when there's far too much inflammatory language about already. She holds the office of Prime Minister. She's describing the views of members of this House, including former members of her own government, when she talks about a subversion of democracy. So could I just make that genuine appeal to her to consider her office when using language of that kind?
And I would make an appeal to members across the whole of this House of considering the duty we have to the British people to deliver the vote that they gave in the referendum of 2016 and to accept that and not to try to find ways of frustrating or stopping Brexit.
Mike Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Prime Minister owes this House a full and frank apology. While stealing 40 winks this morning after my 50th birthday celebrations at the weekend, I had to move train carriages just before Stoke-on-Trent to accommodate the Prime Minister and her entourage. I was forced to spend the rest of the journey with parliamentary colleagues and eminent BBC journalists. With that in mind, the point I really wish to make is one of the things while there's a place of disagreement at the moment, the one thing I do agree with the Prime Minister is that she supports peace on the island of Ireland, and no matter what the tempests and the storms over the next days and weeks, will she keep that as a priority and not be buffeted?
Yes. Can I first of all say to the honourable gentleman, can I thank him for the note that he left in the train carriage when he moved places? But can I seriously say that it is absolutely the case. We have been clear throughout the negotiations we've had with the European Union that we want to respect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. The peace process has brought incredible benefits to Northern Ireland, the people of Northern Ireland. We want to maintain that peace process, and we will not be doing anything that damages that.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, can I from the opposition benches also acknowledge the courtesy with which the Prime Minister has answered an absolute myriad of questions? Mr. Speaker, if I could magic you and the Prime Minister to the beautiful Scottish Highlands, I would show you infrastructure projects such as roads, harbours and airports, which would not have happened if it wasn't for European money. This expenditure was incredibly important in terms of reversing the depopulation that was the historic curse of the Highlands. When I return to my constituency at the end of this long week, and my constituents say to me, Jamie, what will replace this money? Can I ask the Prime Minister what my answer should be?
We will be putting in place the Shared Prosperity Fund, which will be looking at disparities which occur both between nations of the United Kingdom and within communities and regions of the United Kingdom. And we will obviously have to ensure we'll be consulting on how that shared prosperity fund actually operates and the way in which it will operate. But it is that shared prosperity fund which will be ensuring that this is a country that works for everyone.
I must say to the honourable gentleman that his constituency always sounds an immensely agreeable place, and therefore I really must visit. Mr Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. After 2.5 years of complete lack of direction, the Prime Minister wants us to vote for this agreement, which really only puts everything into the transition period. Yet somehow she's trying to convince herself that to avoid the backstop and avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland, within the next year and a half or so, she can agree a trade deal, a customs deal, and find from nowhere a technology solution, have it invented, trialled and implemented within that year and a half period. Can she tell me the key milestone dates for this magic solution, and can she name one major IT infrastructure project delivered in such a timescale?
Say to the honourable gentleman, he talks about the direction that has been over the last 2.5 years. The Lancaster House speech, the Florence speech, the Munich speech, the Mansion House speech, the December 2017 joint report, the agreement in March last year about the arrangements for the implementation period, and now, of course, the political declaration and withdrawal agreement. They set a very clear direction, and it's a good direction for this country. It's a good deal for this country. It's a good deal for Scotland, a good deal for the whole of the UK.
Thank you. Order. Yes, point of order. Yes, point of order, Chris Phil.
Mr Speaker, could you advise on whether there are any ways to remove the need for a money resolution on a bill brought forward by a backbencher? Could you confirm, Mr Speaker, that only the government can move money resolutions?
It's long been the practice. I'm not going to get involved in a detailed disquisition on these matters tonight, which I think is premature and unnecessary. But the honourable gentleman has asked me a question and I furnished him with an answer, and I trust that satisfies him. And if it does, good, and if it doesn't, never mind. Point of order, Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, you may be aware of some speculation on this point in the press. So could you confirm that a committee of the whole House can only be chaired by the chairman of Ways and Means?
Standing orders are perfectly clear. The honourable gentleman needn't ask me, either on his own initiative or at somebody else's urging, a question to which the answer is readily available if he bothers to read the relevant material. It's pretty clear. Point of order, Rebecca Powell.
Mr Speaker, and this is a brave moment for me because I've never asked a point of order before, but I would like to seek just a little bit of clarification, Mr Speaker, and it's regarding these so-called devices that have been much mentioned in the press over the weekend that potentially might give control of the order paper, something I would find deeply concerning, and I'd be very grateful, Mr Speaker, if you might just give some indication of what other members of Parliament you might have had